It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 63. We've been going a lot longer than that, but this is where we look at all matters Australian politics and media, and then have a good look around the world to see what's going on there. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm excellent.
That's very good to hear. Now, it's the 29th of February, Jack, a leap year day, one that only occurs once every 4 years. Surely that is cause for a public holiday in Hong Kong.
No, we haven't got a public holiday here. Perhaps they don't know about it because they use the lunar calendar.
There you go. That explains
Some of the wags in Australian politics were suggesting that when we're looking for a new day for Australia Day, that the 29th of February might be up.
Only once every 4 years. Look, we'd like to wish everyone a happy birthday who's born on the 29th of February. It must be a difficult thing to handle, only having a birthday once every 4 years. What would you do? Would you go for the 28th and just lie about it, or just wait for every fourth year to come around to have your birthday?
Well, you'd pin your ears back on the 29th, wouldn't you? You know, it'd be a big one.
You should really need to let loose, wouldn't you? Yeah, indeed. Look, kicking us off today is some remarks made by, a speech made by ASIO boss, Mike Burgess, who has indicated, among other things, that there was a former MP, federal MP, who he believes had basically betrayed his country and become a spy for a foreign power. We don't know who that foreign power is, and we don't know who that MP is, and Burgess won't say. But it seems that Peter Dutton believes, he said he's got his money on it being a Labor MP. There may be some some wisdom in that. We don't know. He may not even be subject to the briefing that indicates who that person is. His Home Affairs spokesperson, James Patterson, Senator Patterson, has suggested that we should not speculate on who that person is. Rather, we should be concentrating on the fact that MPs are wide open to be subjected to this kind of pressure. Jack.
Yeah, this won't be the first foreign agent to sit in the Australian Parliament.
Oh, really?
There have been.
There's some gossip there. Now, who have we got? You don't have to name names, but when did this happen?
Well, so I believe, even perhaps in cabinet, this was managed by. It was a Labor person. And the Prime Minister had no choice as to who sat in cabinet, because in those days the cabinet positions were by election within the caucus, so they were stuck with this person. And as I understand it, they managed this by keeping the particular minister away from national security issues. I'm just a bit surprised that the ASIO boss is sort of saying this in public. These things used to be the subject of gossip around Parliament House, but they were not
often, is now.
Yeah, not often put on the public record. We pay ASIO a lot of money. This is the stuff that they're supposed to know about and supposed to be able to brief politicians of both sides about, so that the leaders at least know what's going on.
I would see at this stage that the opposition has not been briefed. That would indicate, Dutton using terms like I have my money on it being a Labor MP, a former Labor MP, and also Patterson's remarks that we shouldn't speculate. Burgess actually did talk about terrorist threats. He believes they remain significant, with the most likely perpetrators being those who have fallen into Sunni extremism, But he also mentioned race hate groups. So we're talking about the extreme right in Australia here, driving towards some awful episode that will split Australians on racial grounds, on ethnic grounds. All of those are significant, and Burgess, of course, says that it's not just politicians, but people, senior bureaucrats, senior business people, who are prone to this kind of persuasion. It often comes from a simple LinkedIn message, Jack.
Yeah, I would expect our foreign intelligence service, ACIS, to be doing this sort of work, and we should expect other countries to be doing it in Australia.
All right. Well, that won't be the last we hear of this particular story, because the gossip will rise to fever pitch. It'll be very interesting to see question time over the next few days and weeks. In the meantime, Jack, Scott Morrison wandered off into the sunset, and in the Australian at least, Paul Kelly and Greg Sheridan said that history will treat him kindly. What do you think Scott Morrison will be treated kindly by the history books, Jack?
Firstly, I don't know whether did you see any of his farewell speech in Parliament?
Yeah, I did. It was an emotional Scott Morrison, particularly emotional around the time that he recalled a car accident involving the prime ministerial vehicle and others, where it left a number of staffers injured. He became quite emotional about all of that. He said he also wanted to be remembered. He also aimed to be the sort of ex-Prime Minister that Julia Gillard is, and by that I presume he means that he doesn't want to be interfering in domestic politics from time to time, as some of the exes have.
Or consumed by bitterness, as some of the exes have. I wasn't counting, but I'm told that it got up to 11 mentions of Taylor Swift in his farewell speech.
Well, I think he'd been to 3 of the shows.
Yeah, which I thought was slightly bizarre. And his successor, Anthony Albanese, was very kind to him in his remarks as well.
Yeah, but how will he be seen? I mean, we talked about this last week, and I raised the spectre of Billy McMahon, who's arguably our worst Prime Minister. Morrison, unlike McMahon, won an election. He was dealt a pretty cruel hand. I would say that he didn't expect to win in 2019, and nor did his party. And they woke up after the election day and said, "Gee, we're in power again. What are we going to do now?" And that stayed like that for a little while until, of course, the pandemic hit. And I know a lot of people would be very angry with Morrison over some, perhaps, of the pandemic management overreach, the closure of the country to immigration, to overseas travellers, to Australians returning home. It was seen to be pretty harsh. But in his defence, we really didn't have the pandemic measures in place, the quarantine facilities available to do anything else.
Yeah, he's far from the worst Prime Minister, and he's not really in Billy McMahon's league. I think Billy is has a strong lead in that race.
Early clubhouse leader.
Yeah, he's the early clubhouse leader in that. Morrison's government will be treated reasonably kindly. It wasn't particularly good or particularly bad, but Morrison himself has something that will hang around his neck forever, and that is the multiple ministries he appointed himself to. I think that's going to be treated
one that's
very
not
harshly.
Easily explained.
No.
Yeah.
But he's right in his approach to the future. Julia Gillard really is sort of the gold standard at the moment for former prime ministers, along with John Howard, I might add.
I wouldn't say. Howard gets stuck into politics and campaigning, and I've got no problem with that. But Julia Gillard has withdrawn and hasn't basically come out to lambast her foes from within her party. She did as she said she was going to do. If she lost the spill motion, she was going to retire and do so gracefully.
And go on and do other things. So, but neither of them are consumed with bitterness about their demise, which was an improvement on everybody else of recent times. And neither of them have been out shilling for foreign governments or companies in foreign places, like some of them have been. So,
wow, you look at the Morrison ministry, and there's a few out there shilling, Jack, for
exactly, yes. This is not a.
It's nothing. There's nothing illegal about that. You would question the ethics of it, but there's nothing illegal about that. And politicians need to go and earn a quid, and they have developed a great deal of expertise in certain areas. I know the Greens and some of the crossbenchers are talking about putting a limit or a period of time before let's say retired ministers of the Crown can engage in consultancy, and I think that's got a fair bit going for it, doesn't it?
It does, as would restoring the old parliamentary pension scheme. I think that getting rid of that was a mistake.
Yeah, I think so too. And that was the Mark Latham and John Howard Me Too movement, Jack.
Yeah, look at what happens in the United States. Well, I think senators get about 180,000 a year US in the Senate. Right? They all get a lot richer than you would expect people on 180,000 to get.
That's the good reason, isn't it? You've got to remunerate politicians properly. Otherwise, you do have potential issues around corruption.
Yeah, and we don't want Australian politicians and ministers thinking, well, my career as a politician is about to end. How can I use my current position to ensure that I've got a steady income in the future? We don't want that. We don't want them to have to think about that.
Well, at least the gaming industry does provide, Jack. It's a retirement village for a great many politicians, particularly those on the Labor side. God bless the gaming industry, Jack.
As is the superannuation industry.
Yeah, indeed. Lots of board positions there. Speaking of corruption, Jack, Gladys Berejiklian is before the New South Wales Court of Appeal seeking to clear her name over an ICAC finding that she had engaged in corrupt conduct, but with the ICAC report did not require it or did not suggest any criminal offences had occurred, but had declared that she had acted corruptly. The 2-day hearing was an odd one, Jack. Well, there were on the first day, Brett Walker for Gladys Berejiklian told the court that the retirement of ICAC Assistant Commissioner Judge Ruth McColl, that her term ending before the report was complete might make the ICAC to have reported outside its authority, Jack.
Yeah, I read that and nearly fell off my chair. That's an extraordinary error, if it's true.
If it's true, yeah. It's a claim made in court.
It wasn't that she was retired. It was that her term expired. Right? And I've been through the exam. I was never in such an exalted role as an ICAC commissioner, but I was a federal tribunal member for 10 years, and I can still remember the date the term ended, June 4th, 2004. And they were downsizing the tribunal, so it was about 20 or 25 of us finishing up the same day. And we all understood that any decision you're going to make, any findings that you were going to make, had to be signed off on and receive the stamp from the tribunal before 5 o'clock that night. Otherwise, they expired with you. No one had to tell us this. We just all knew it. So it's extraordinary to think that ICAC would make an error like that.
We shall see. The Court of Appeal, New South Wales Court of Appeal, will make its determinations in, I think there's several months away before that happens. On the other side of the coin is that the argument has been made that Gladys Berejiklian was influenced by serial pest. That's a quote. Put forward to the New South Wales Court of Appeal. Daryl Maguire was a serial pest. And relate to those findings made by the ICAC around her conduct between 2016 and 2018. So we shall see how that all goes, Jack. How significant is it really? It's really just a reputational issue for Gladys Berejiklian going forward, isn't it? There's nothing that will arise out of it, out of the New South Wales Court of Appeal's verdict, that will change much at all.
She just doesn't want to go to her grave with a corruption finding against her, and fair enough too.
Yeah, okay. There may be other consequences for ICAC if indeed what was put forward by Brett Walker is the case, that the retirement of the Assistant ICAC Commissioner without a report being completed might cause some administrative review and some changes in the ICAC within the ICAC, Jack.
The best change they could make with ICAC would be to tear the whole thing up and start again.
Yeah, look, obviously, we're just moving on now. That's what you think. I mean, I'm not sure that I actually believe it, but as a journalist, I think something like the ICAC, compared to the IBAC, I mean, you could barely get anything out of the IBAC, and that's the way it's been constructed, at the Victorian equivalent. But the ICAC is juicy with news, Jack. Perp walks and all sorts of fun for journalists. But moving on to energy, I noticed that Chris Mitchell piece caught your eye. I read that piece on Monday. And Chris references a number of European countries in particular that are walking away from zero emissions technologies. Vehicle manufacturers like Volvo and Renault are walking away from their EVs, from their EV production. But we'll get to EVs in a moment. Are we putting all the eggs in the renewables basket? I think that was pretty much his view. That's Chris Mitchell. And complaining that journalists took that view themselves.
I read it and was wondering whether he's a podcast listener, Chris Mitchell, because we've talked about this before. His most important point was to note that, yes, there is a growth in renewable use, but that growth is happening slower than the rise in overall energy use. So, in fact, even though renewables are growing, the amount of fossil fuel use is also still growing, albeit at a much more smaller level. But the growth in renewables is not taking away from the use of fossil fuels. It's just helping keep pace with the growth in energy overall.
Growth in energy demand, yeah.
And you and I have spoken about this before. We've quoted International Energy Agency figures that support this. So I think he's right. You wouldn't know this if you were reading the Australian media, but there's a lot of sound and fury about how important renewables are, but they aren't that important.
Look, definitely part of the mix, and I'd always say that renewables are always going to be cheaper because no one has to shovel stuff into a furnace. That's part of the problem. You've got to extract the coal, you've got to extract the gas, you've got to chuck it in the furnace to make it all work. There are big issues for EVs that are emerging, Jack. Just moving on a little bit. Apple, I don't know if you saw this, but Apple has spent billions in development of an electric vehicle. And this week they announced that they were ceasing production. Well, basically production hadn't started, but they had a number of prototypes out there. And I think the I think there are over 1,000 employees working for Apple on EV production. Most of them have been shuffled off now into sort of emerging technology stuff. But so Apple has given up on it. Mercedes has said it's backtracking on its EV commitment, and will continue manufacturing gas-powered cars. That's petrol-powered cars well into the 2030s. The internal combustion engine, Jack. I think this is looking more and more like the head of Toyota, Mr. Toyota, has got it pretty right that the real growth in sales comes around hybrids, non-rechargeable hybrids.
I think that's right.
That seems to be the way.
And I think Toyota was right about it.
Yeah, sorry, go on. I mean,
I think Toyota was right about this. That either the plug-in hybrids or the straight electric vehicles have problems that don't look like being solved. Terrible in cold weather. The battery range drops away to almost nothing when the weather gets like cold, like it does in Northern Europe or Northern America in the north.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's not just that, but there and we'll get to supply chains in a minute. But there are a great. I mean, the batteries themselves require a great deal of lithium. They require a great many rare metals that are becoming increasingly difficult to find. Australia does have the largest deposits of lithium anywhere in the world, so there are opportunities there for our mining industry. But there are a number of other rare metals that are extracted often in pretty ordinary sort of circumstances in places like Central Africa, Zaire, and I think I've got the name of the country wrong, the old Zaire perhaps, the DRC I think is what I'm looking for, and in other parts of the world where mining employment conditions are just terrible.
The cobalt mines you're talking about.
I think there's also, look, it might be the cobalt mines that, and routinely people are buried while extracting it almost by hand.
Kids extracting it by hand.
Yeah. It's not always adults. But here's probably the big story of the week, Jack. And Reuters reports that Tesla and Volvo have shut down production over the Red Sea shipping crisis. So this is not so much an energy issue. This is the fact that a great many tankers are being told not to go through the Red Sea because of Houthi missile attacks, and they're having to go around the Horn of Africa and up to Europe that way, which is going to cause a great deal of problems. Not just for EV manufacturing or even motor vehicle manufacturing. The prospects of this, becoming causing great global inflationary pressures. One, you have a sharp rise in marine petroleum. So it's more expensive to move the tankers around, and then they're going further, which is going to cause significant delays in the short term, but also additional costs for manufacturers in Western Europe if this issue with Red Sea, with the Houthis in the Red Sea, is not resolved. So we got Tesla shutting down in Belgium and Berlin. And Volvo shutting down in their headquarters as well.
The Red Sea problem also extends to undersea cables. It's believed that the Houthis and perhaps the Russians were involved in breaking open an undersea cable in the Red Sea in the last few days.
I haven't heard those reports. I do know that
because there are major internet links that run through the Red Sea.
Interesting. I do know, of course, that the US and the UK launched strikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen, done during the week. A very, very convenient tweet was published by US Central Command, where they acknowledged that they had, with missile strikes, taken out a significant missile firing capacity and drone strike capacity among the Houthis. What I found amusing about that, perhaps not amusing, but a little bit stunning, was that that there were a number of people coming in and saying that the Americans were attacking Yemenis, were killing civilians, the usual sort of suspects there. And then there was a fairly senior spokesperson for the Palestinian group saying that they would allow all ships to come through provided that they weren't licensed with the US or the UK.
It's the Red Sea problem is a problem that's going to need to be solved.
It's going to need to be solved by striking harder at the Houthis' capability. Just to explain to our listeners, they are entirely funded and armed by the Iranians, and so while this is absolutely necessary, you can't have this. You simply cannot have world trade dislocated in this way. But while attacks against the Houthis continue, there is again that overall threat. The Middle East is such a complex and dynamic place that the Iranians could be dragged into war. Certainly, it would indicate that the Americans are going all in with the Saudis too, Jack.
Yes.
Very interesting thing. So the Red Sea into the Suez is a way of cutting basically weeks on the water for tankers, but also the Panama Canal, because of drought there, Jack. Low water levels have basically slowed movement of tankers through the Panama Canal. So there is potentially inflationary issues arising from both instances. That it will cost more. It will cost more for goods to arrive in Europe from Asia and elsewhere, and it will take longer.
Yes.
All right. Over in the United States, Alabama IVF treatments have been put on hold, Jack. You must have seen this. It's Alabama's Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are children, Jack. They're not getting any smarter over there, are they?
No, they did rule that, yes.
They did rule that. It's meant that IVF treatment places in the state of Alabama have basically put everything on hold. It arose from, it's just not a legislative issue, it arose from a ruling in the Alabama Supreme Court where the parents who underwent an IVF procedure, and this sounds pretty ordinary, but I'll read it anyway. The parents alleged that in December 2020, a patient at the Mobile, Alabama hospital, where the frozen embryos were being stored, walked into the fertility clinic through an unsecured doorway and removed several embryos from the cryogenic nursery. The patient's hand was freeze-burned by the extremely low temperatures the embryos were stored in, and the patient dropped them on the floor, killing them. I think that's probably the wrong word, but the CNN report couldn't find a better one. The parents sued for wrongful death, but at a trial court, these claims were dismissed. But in a stunning reversal last week, the state Supreme Court disagreed, noting extrauterine children or unborn children located outside of a biological uterus at the time they are killed are children, and they are covered under the state's wrongful death of a minor law. Quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. I believe the parliamentarians, the state Congress people in Alabama are moving on this, and that will be resolved.
There has been a bit of a rush of legislation to try and stop this. I did see one Alabama Republican member of their state Congress talk about what a wonderful decision it was. So it's not as if it's completely unanimous, but there are some laws designed to keep this, to fix this up. Not their abortion laws, but their rather idiotic ruling of the Supreme Court, the Alabama Supreme Court on this, and that will have to be dealt with legislatively. It's just a staggering thing. It gets back to this. This is the issue that will kill Trump, I believe, if this is left to fester. And abortion generally is left to fester. I think it'll be the issue that will kill him. And he'll get to a point where he simply can't talk about it.
He's already spoken about this at a press conference.
Well, he's spoken about it a number of times, Jack. He gloated that he was the man who made the abortion ban happen, and that went over like a lead balloon. And then he talked about a 16-week thing because it's, I think, 4 months. He decided 16 weeks is 4 months, which of course it isn't.
I watched the press conference about the IVF, and what he said was he supports the right of parents who want to have a beautiful little baby to do so through IVF. It was quite straightforward.
Yeah, but I think any sort of guilt, this will be sort of guilt by association. And like I said, when he gloated that Roe v. Wade was overturned on his watch and by his Supreme Court picks, that will go over very, very poorly, and try and get and will, I think, and we've seen this in 2020, and we to a degree, and then we saw it in 2022 in the midterms. There, big numbers coming out to vote Democrat, Jack, particularly among women. President Biden has said, getting on to matters deeply presidential and electoral, with the 2024 presidential election coming forward, he said that a number of foreign leaders have whispered in his ear saying, you've got to beat Trump, because if you don't, then I'll have the same sort of problems with populists in my country. He said, not because I'm so special, these people said to him, his foreign leader said to him, you've got to win because my democracy is at stake if the other guy wins. 9 heads of state have done that with me, said Joe.
I wonder whether that included Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl.
Well, who knows? 9 heads of state, who's he spoken to? He speaks to pretty much everyone around the world. It could be. And there has been a bit of a pushback against the suggestion that Biden might be tapped on the shoulder in and around the Democratic National Convention. When is that, July or August? I think it's August, isn't it?
August in Chicago.
August in Chicago, yeah. So that he might get tapped on the shoulder. He did, of course, win his Michigan primary fairly comfortably.
Although there was 15% who wrote uncommitted on the ballot papers.
Yeah, I mean, look, the primary process for Biden is fairly simple. It's just a matter of whether he's going to run or whether he can be tapped on the shoulder.
The significance of that 15% is that Michigan's is the most Arab and Muslim state in the United States, and there's a lot of pushback against what they see as the inadequacy of the US government's response to Israel. So 15% people writing uncommitted is probably a little danger sign as to whether you're going to get these people to turn out and vote for you in a general election.
I think there's danger generally for all governments of the left around support for Israel. I think there's potential threats for the Labor Party in Australia, and certainly, as we've seen in the British Labor Party as well. I particularly in most democratic countries where there is non-mandatory voting, voluntary voting. I think what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Gaza might have a significant impact on how big their turnouts are. Look, are we dealing with something that is of this moment and not necessarily of a moment in November?
Hard to know.
Yeah.
We don't know what will be happening in Gaza in November, so it's very hard
simply
to predict.
don't know. There's no way of knowing. I mean, we've got both sides, Hamas and the Netanyahu government, walking back the expectations of a ceasefire in the last 24 hours. A ceasefire must come, but how at some point. But how enduring it is anybody's guess. So these are big problems for the left going around the world with so many elections this year.
President Biden said he expects there to be a ceasefire by the end of the weekend, so by Monday.
And that's an indication, if nothing else, of the fact that Biden sees this as a serious political problem for him. Just moving into Michigan, where, of course, he was elected, or he won, not elected, but he won the primary in Michigan. A Democratic strategist in Michigan who backs Biden and was granted anonymity to speak candidly said Democrats are in trouble because every day, as violence in Gaza continues, getting those voters back becomes more of a challenge for Biden. And that's it in a nutshell. It's not just Michigan. It's a lot of blue states. It's a lot of swing states, and all about and these things are all about the turnout.
Well, they're about the turnout because they're about a minority. A majority of people in the United Kingdom and the United States more or less back their government's approach to being supportive of Israel up to a point.
Yeah.
But there's a minority of people who oppose that, a very noisy minority of people who oppose that, and they tend to be voters in the blue areas, in the left areas. So that's a problem where turnout's important. It becomes a problem. Compulsory voting is not such a big issue, but with turnout elections, it is.
Yes, it is. And look, while Australia does have mandatory voting, it continues to have sort of embarrassing sort of problems for the Labor Party in Australia too. So these are issues that affect left-wing governments all around the world. Meanwhile, Jack, Donald Trump flogged Nikki Haley in her home state, South Carolina. There was still a fairly significant vote for her, wasn't there? But in her home state, there's no way of polishing that turd and saying she's done okay. But she's continuing in the race, and the Republicans go to Michigan over the weekend.
Yeah, there's a bit of an argument that Nikki Haley's staying in the race for this reason, that if Trump were to lose the election this year, because he will be the nominee, if he were to lose the election this year, that would place her in the number one slot to be the candidate in 2028.
Yeah, she seems to have a bit of money behind her. I know it's the Koch brothers, or the group that is it the Heritage Foundation to get behind them. They stopped donations to Nikki Haley after the South Carolina loss, and the money will be drying up. And that's going to be the big problem, isn't it? Eventually, if she'll get to Michigan, if she's well beaten there, I think that should do it. But we will see. There's just a glimmer that she might do okay in Michigan, by the way. Just a glimmer in some of the polling.
Yeah, there's also been some suggestions from the polling that perhaps some of her support's coming from the other side of the aisle, shall we say?
Yeah, but the Michigan primary, correct me if I'm wrong, but Michigan primary is an open primary, Republican primary. So, yeah, I mean, it can still, people can still vote voluntarily there, regardless of their background.
They can be Republicans for a day.
Yes, they can pretend they're Republicans. They pop on a red hat, go down the polling booth. I think if she loses, that would be enough. I just, it'll end up costing her more money than she's probably got if she wants to persist. But she's clearly frustrating Trump. and we know this because he's giving her a bit of abuse along the way. We shall see.
That always is the biggest tell. If someone's having some effect on you, that you keep talking about them. It's why we know that Peter Dutton's actually being quite effective, because the Labor government can't shut up about him at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's part of a more considered tactic where they sort of lost their way. It was like, we don't really care about the opposition. We're above them. We're above the dirty politics where we would slander and abuse our opponents. And they said, hang on, what are we doing here? We're in politics. We should be slandering and abusing our opponents. So I think there's a fair bit more. I mean, look, Dutton, we did have a news poll this week, Jack, just very briefly off the subject. Dutton's approval ratings are very similar to Albanese's, both in the negative, not by too many points. Labor continues to lead 52-48 two-party preferred. There was a big headline around about Labor losing the primary vote race with the coalition, but the coalition's been in front in the primary vote race for several months now. And that's not really, their vote needs to be around 40% if they're going to win, and they're around about 36% at the moment.
My view of this hasn't changed. I think it's very unlikely they can win the next election. But if you keep talking about him, the reason you're doing that is because he's actually making an impact.
All right, the Trump New York fraud case, Jack. Would you like to cry some tears for Donald Trump, who's a bit lighter in the wallet now? He hasn't paid any of these things, of course. He hasn't yet. I think he's up for about $450 million, and a ban on conducting his business for 3 years. Are we going to cry some crocodile tears for him, Jack? I noticed you've quoted Rich Lowry, who's he writes for the Nation Review, isn't it? And he's gone, this is a terrible thing because it could happen to if it happens to Trump, it could happen to anybody else.
Well, it is an unusual thing. There's no precedent for this, for what's happened, and it's a victimless crime in the sense that no one says they've lost any money. So it is. I don't think it will stand up on appeal, to be quite honest.
You said that last week. Yeah, we'll see about that. Deutsche Bank said, "Look, who are the lenders?" They said, "We don't care." And
they got their money back.
And they got
not only
they
get their money back,
repaid.
Not only get their money back with interest, they'd be happy to do business with him again.
Yeah, well, I think they do. Yeah. So look, these are going to cause problems. We've got the criminal indictments that look increasingly like they will be pushed back beyond the election, with the possible exception of the New York slush fund matter. The others may well be pushed back beyond the next election.
Just some breaking news on that. The Supreme Court has announced, the Supreme Court of the United States has announced that they will hear the Trump application for a presidential shield that's a shield of all actions taken while he's president. They'll hear those arguments on April 22.
Gee whiz, he's in for a rough year next year if he loses the election, mate. He's looking at 90 odd criminal indictments, 91 criminal indictments, and they'll all fall out next year. So he's all in on this. But look, the financial stuff is probably more important right now because these criminal indictments are being cast off into the distant future. And Trump's ability to be able to fight an election with financial support, to have the money to do it, and it's basically a multi-billion-dollar exercise these days. Biden's got plenty; he's got a decent old war chest, but a lot of the money that's gone into the Trump PACs and through donations there is being spent on lawyers and fines.
So we might have a competition, a race between one candidate who hasn't got the money to do it, and another candidate who has got the money but can't go out and campaign.
Like he'd be doing it from the Delaware. He'd be doing it from the Delaware basement, I'm sure. Moving on just to matters economic in the United States, Jack. We want to talk about small business very briefly, and it's one of those things that doesn't get touched on very much. We talk about our own small business here and their significant contribution to the economy, but in the States, 33 million, more than 33 million small businesses exist and gainfully employ 62 million Americans, nearly 50% of the private sector, Jack.
Yeah. And so much of the media coverage and political activity revolves around looking after the big companies, and that I think is an error.
Yeah, it is something that we've probably, we might be ahead of the Americans in political terms. I mean, it seems to me that the Liberal Party has pretty much forsaken big business as a supporter, and they're going down that small business pathway. It is a sort of a desperate look for a constituency that they haven't always had. But yeah, there are profound concerns around attaching yourself to big corporates these days.
Yeah, I think there are. And because I think big corporates like playing at politics but aren't very good at it.
It's a really interesting point. I mean, we did see a number of big corporates line up for the voice, and that seemed to be more of a problem for the yes vote than it was for the no vote. I remember that I think one of the two major supermarkets, either Coles or Woolworths, were playing sort of promotional stuff around the voice in their supermarkets, received a number of complaints and then turned it all off. I think there's a sort of touchy-feely sort of sense around corporate governance and corporate identity that it does not sit well with your average Australian, if that person actually exists.
Yes. Well, they found that, on the voice as an example, the big corporates found themselves at odds with a pretty clear majority of people. Like I say, they want to play politics, but they don't have the skills to play politics.
Yeah, there's that, but there's also the fact that, I mean, look, if you're a customer of a bank, you're a customer of a supermarket, and let's face it, it's just everybody. They're probably not your best friends. You go to the self-serve checkout and it basically accuses you of conducting a bit of theft, or you applied for a loan through one of the big fours and got knocked back. It's not that kind of relationship, Jack.
No.
It's a customer up against a big, large, powerful institution.
It's a purely transactional relationship. There is no love.
All right. Meanwhile, Jack, in France, France has expelled a radical imam who made unacceptable remarks about the country's flag. It's the Tricolore, Jack. How dare he? So this is Majoub Majoubi. He appeared to call the French flag satanic. Red, white and blue. Gee whiz, there's a fair few flags bearing those colours, including our own. Called the French flag satanic in a video event, and he got bundled up into a van for his trouble and punted out of the country.
He did. He lived in France for 36 years.
He couldn't have been a citizen, I presume. Was he a French citizen?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
but the French are always untroubled by worries about the European Court of Human Rights or anything like this. They just ignore it.
I love the French.
They go right ahead and deal with it the way they think it ought to happen. They always have done this, and they always will.
So Majoubi, who actually almost 4 decades ago came from Tunisia to France, has been sent back. He was arrested after the video circulated showing him describing a tricolor flag as satanic and saying it has no value with Allah. The Imam later said he was sorry. I bet he is, if he had caused any offence, arguing that his remarks about the flag were a slip of the tongue. Interesting. But it didn't do him any good, Jack.
No.
Get in the truck.
The French don't mess about, man.
Yeah, all right. In the United Kingdom, Jack, there was a very chaotic scene. And we haven't actually covered this. The Gaza debate in the UK, in the Commons, in the House of Commons in the British Parliament, Jack. It was an absolute disaster. Have you seen the footage of it?
Yeah, but just let me take you through exactly what happened.
Good.
The Scottish National Party put up a proposal for the House to call for an immediate ceasefire. That would have and the reason they did this, because this was going to split the Labor Party vote between the people who absolutely want a ceasefire at any cost and the people who are basically supportive of Israel. Keir Starmer's the Labor leader, is trying to kind of straddle two horses a little bit. He wants to keep on board the far left group we were talking about before,
yes,
who are sort of pretty much pro-Hamas, but also understand that the majority of Britons are basically pro-Israel on this. And that's why the SNP motion went up. The Labor leader went and spoke to the Speaker and asked could he bend the rules to allow a Labor amendment to be put so that the Labor people could vote for that rather than the SNP motion.
Yes.
And the Speaker, to his discredit, agreed with that. He says because he had been receiving briefings that allowing that vote to go ahead would put MPs at risk. So we had a big kerfuffle arising out of that.
Well, it's a reasonable point. I mean, we have had, I think, 2 UK MPs killed in office, murdered while in office. So that's actually a reasonable point to make, Jack.
Yeah, but I don't think as a country you can allow the threat to kill to determine what's debated in the Commons and what gets voted on.
It was uproarious scenes in the Commons. As the Speaker's still got a heartbeat, hasn't he? He hasn't gone yet.
He'll survive, but he's probably going to retire. I would think he won't. The tradition is in the UK that whilst you're Speaker, the other major party, that you no longer sit in the party room while you're Speaker, and that's the same in Australia, really. But whilst you're Speaker, if you're a Labor Party person, the Conservatives won't stand a candidate against you at the next election, for instance. So you just hold your seat, you sail straight through, unopposed. But that
and he's a Tory. He's a Tory, isn't he? He's a Tory.
No, he's a Labor. He was a Labor Party man.
So how did that get up? How did a Tory government with a significant majority, which it has, appoint a Labor Speaker?
It was thought that he was the most suitable person.
Oh, that is unusual compared to Australia, where you always get, unless you've got a hung parliament, where you always get a fellow from the government sitting on the Treasury benches, he or she will be nominated on the numbers. So there you go. There's a bit that I've learned about that today, Jack. So what's going to happen? Is this exposing, as we talked about, Starmer's vulnerability on the left?
It is a bit. He got through that day with some help from the Speaker, but that doesn't mean the problem's gone away. Every day in the Guardian, there's another piece saying, what Starmer and the Labor Party are doing is wrong, etc., etc. So they're going to face, as you said before, continuing attacks from within their own support, so their own support base. And that's a tricky one to handle.
While we speak of The Guardian, don't let me forget to mention The Guardian's cricket writing, Jack, after England's series loss, now confirmed in India. It was some of the most delusional writing I've seen in a long time, where they just decided...
You couldn't be talking about Barney Ronay, could you?
Oh, my God. We'll get to it. We shouldn't. We shouldn't get. But the good 400 run loss was the phrase that got it for me.
So essentially, Starmer's problem, and this is going to be a problem in the United States as well, is that he understands that the majority position is pretty much supportive of Israel, but he's got a noisy and nasty minority who are saying, no, we're pro-Hamas. And how does he reconcile those two things?
All right. And look, he is in very, very strong position with polling showing the Labor Party has a majority, would have a majority, have a significant majority, but they're getting over 50% of the vote. We could talk, I was almost going to say primary vote, but that's all there is in the UK. So over 50% of the vote there, and looking like the Sunak government is basically on a death march. Meanwhile, Jack, in Europe, around NATO, Hungary's parliament overwhelmingly approved Sweden's bid to join NATO on Monday, clearing the way for the Nordic nations' accession to the alliance after nearly 2 years of intense negotiations, mainly involving Turkey. So that will now go ahead, and the Swedes will join the Finns in NATO very soon, Jack.
Yeah, the Hungarian vote was the last remaining hurdle. So, the Swedes are in.
Yeah, they will be, and that also the issues with the Turks were Turkey, I should say, Jack. Have been sort of ironed over a bit. So these two countries, I mean, when we talk about Putin's folly, this is part of it. Putin's folly in Ukraine. Two countries who were absolutely devoted to not joining NATO, Sweden and Finland, after all these years have put their hands up and said, yeah, we're in. And of course, Finland shares a border with Russia.
You can knock Vladimir all you like, but isn't he a unifying force?
That's right, yes. Well, in the early stages of the invasion of Ukraine, I think we discussed this at the time, and the big question was just how unified is Europe on this? And I think the answer overall has been pretty strong.
Yes, there is some growing impatience with the stalemate. That it's and there's some backwards and forwards about, okay, we've gotten this far, but what do we do now? But yes, they are unified.
All right, moving on to energy again, but this time in Europe, and it relates to a tax credit scheme proposed by President Biden at $400 billion into subsidies for EVs. China has funneled massive amounts of money into building EVs. They have a significant investment stake there, and manufacturing rolling off the. Vehicles rolling off the line, and Europe, however, is having some problems, Jack.
They are, and interestingly, there were 73 major companies from 17 sectors, including chemicals, pharmaceuticals, engineering, signed what they call the Antwerp Declaration, calling on the EU to relax regulations, lower energy costs and increase investment while it still has some industry left.
The Antwerp Declaration, Jack, that sounds ominous. That's almost
it
like
doesn't it?
The defenestration of Prague.
Yeah, it does.
So, yes, they're asking them to relax regulations on the net zero. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
They're not quite sure. Well, they haven't indicated where.
No.
So is it around vehicles, transport? What are we talking about? Agriculture we know about has been a significant issue in the Netherlands, in Flanders, in Belgium, also in Germany now. And the French farmers are, well, they're never happy, but they take to the streets, for a bit of a day off.
Yeah. The agricultural battle sort of already been lost. Ursula von der Leyen's already indicated that she'll be walking back the regulations in that regard. But it's becoming clear that in the manufacturing industries of various kinds, that European manufacturers are unhappy, terminally unhappy, if you like, that they are having higher energy costs than their competitors in China.
We're still seeing energy costs. Well, let's talk about just the price of petrol in this country, which is back up to about $2 a litre. And a lot of this is driven by the Ukrainian conflict, of course, isn't it?
It is. But what's happening in manufacturing in Europe is that the Chinese are burning coal and using cheap energy, and the Europeans have been told, no, you can't do that. You've got to use expensive energy, and they don't like it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We're going to go to sport, Jack. Just an hour into the show. There's a bit to discuss there. Taron Thomas, a North Melbourne player. I saw he was the subject of a mural around North Melbourne. His photo around the club has been taken down. The mural's been has basically disappeared, been painted over. Taron Thomas, of course, has been. Have we got to criminal status there, Jack? In terms of domestic violence, there are a number of claims made about him that he has not rejected. He's put his hand up for in terms of domestic violence in the home setting.
I'm not aware of any criminal proceedings, but
no, I'm not
certainly
either.
There are AFL proceedings underway.
And that's basically it. He's been essentially scrubbed from the AFL record. Certainly North Melbourne Footy Club believes that's the case. I don't know if you saw an article written by Russell Jackson, Jack, around some awful revelations about teachers within the state education department who were sexually abusing kids. There was a Victorian inquiry into this around the Beaumaris Primary School, very limited inquiry, but it's clear that there were more extensive numbers of offending teachers and so forth, and like the Catholic Church, they would just simply once the protests became too loud, they would just shuffle the teachers on. But the thing, and then that was a great story, and Russell Jackson's a wonderful journalist. But the thing that caught my eye, Jack, was around the Little League. That a number of these teachers ended up running the Little League, and you and I will remember it. Certain people, they have Auskick now and have had for many, many years. But in the old days, when we were watching our footy at the grounds, every half time, the two competing sides would be represented by, I think, about an under-10 outfit. They were generally taken from schools. They would change pretty much week from week, schools and sporting clubs. And so if you went to see Carlton and Collingwood, then Carlton and Collingwood would play in the Little League match at half time. And it's clear that there were a number of active pedophiles in and around that competition. And to make it even more chilling, those kids would come in to have a shower after they'd played their half-time game, and everyone else was watching the footy because the men were back on the ground watching the third quarter while these guys were monstering these kids. I believe St Kilda was extremely bad, but I think a lot of the old suburban clubs have got some difficult. Have got some questions to answer about what they were doing in terms of protecting kids. There are also allegations around the under-19 competition and kids playing there could be as young as 14 or 15 being abused. There was a Western Bulldogs player in that under-19 competition as a younger teen, and he's made a claim, or a successful claim, in the Victorian Supreme Court, and a multi-million-dollar damages have been awarded. How long? It's a very long run up there, Jack. But how long can the AFL, ignore what is clearly a massive liability for them?
Oh, I don't think very long at all. The case involving I think he was, I'm not sure he was a volunteer or an employee at the Footscray, the old Footscray.
Volunteer, sort of team manager with the under-19s, yeah.
Yeah, and I saw some of the evidence, and the former president of Footscray had to give evidence, etc., etc. It was all very embarrassing, really. It's not the most surprising thing I've ever heard that where you have kids' sport like this, that you attract some part of the people who help out with this who might have pedophilic instincts. This has sort of been happening as long as these sort of things have been happening.
Yeah, this sort of predatory behaviour will draw these offenders into sport.
There's lots of very good people who go and help out with these sports, but you'll also always have some small part of them.
Yeah, but with the case of the Western Bulldogs victim, the club had to do all the talking. The club had to take on all the liability, and I think now with some of these revelations around the Little League competition and some of the issues around the under-19 competitions, and it's not just in the Western Bulldogs. St Kilda seems to have had a really significant problem. And there will be civil actions arising from that. It's just the AFL has been able to look the other way and go la 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 la, nothing to do with us. And I think that the day is that day is coming to an end, and the AFL will have to deal with this.
It also might be time for some of the sports organisations like the AFL and the NRL to get off their high horse and admit that they are full of flawed human beings like every other institution and organisation in the country.
I'd also add that Russell Jackson's revelations on the ABC website, if you're looking for it, listeners, and it ran as a segment in their 7:30 program. The behaviour of the education department in regard to this was so similar to the Catholic Church. The first thing I thought of when I was reading these things, and I know Russell quite well, and we discussed this before it had gone to print or some of the matters, is that as I said before, they behaved exactly like we know that the Catholic Church did in schools, in and around churches, and when the complaints from parishioners became too loud, they would just simply shuffle the people on. The thing that caught my eye was, the question that came straight to my mind was, why wasn't the Royal Commission looking into this? These are all historic offences. They're going back to the same sorts of periods that we were looking at in the Royal Commission, and I don't understand it. I mean, what Russell has actually done is gone back and looked through. I mean, he's interviewed victims and he's interviewed, club officials and other teachers that taught with these PEDs. But essentially, he's gone back through back copies of the Truth and the Age to find these guys actually before the courts. Some as early as 1970, I think 75. And then many of them being convicted of historic offending in the 1990s and 2000s. again, should have been grist for mill for the Royal Commission. It's almost like I can hear a Jared Henderson column coming out saying there really was a Catholic bias, an anti-Catholic bias in the Royal Commission.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of publicity before the Royal Commission was called about what was happening in the Catholic Church. So perhaps the Royal Commissioner thought that's what they needed to investigate.
All right. Well, it's one to watch, and it's going to be a big story this year, listeners. I can tell you that. Driven a lot by the journalism of Russell Jackson, fantastic journalist, very handy fast bowler for Frankston back in the day too. But there will be more revelations coming about this. Where I kept saying VFL, where the AFL, who were the successors of the VFL, will now not be able to look the other way and pretend this hasn't happened.
It was always foolish, even while the Royal Commission was running, to think that the Catholic Church's problems were peculiar to them. That this is the sort of thing that happens in lots of organisations where you have that opportunity, that you attract people who will want to take advantage of that opportunity. And the natural instinct of most of those organisations is to protect the institution rather than to protect. That is always
the way, isn't it? That's the behaviour you've got to change. Yes, you will have. Unfortunately, I mean, we can go about the various prevention things, but where you do have offenders in an environment where kids are, it's perhaps almost predictable that will occur. But where the failures occur is the people who oversee them and them saying, well, my first instinct is to protect the institution rather than the rights of the child or the victim. And that's the behaviour you need to break down. My view is you should criminalise it. You know, if you learn of an offence and you do nothing, you do not report it to police, I believe that should be a criminal offence and it should come with a fairly long jail term.
Yeah, I need to think about that.
Lock a few school principals up, mate, and I guarantee you the behaviour will change.
Yeah, I need to think that through. But yes, that's the behaviour you've got to change. That's correct.
Yeah,
and it was never absolutely peculiar to the Catholic Church. It exists. Right across the board.
The Royal Commission walked us through the behaviour of the Anglican Church. I mean, a whole raft of bodies. Swimming Australia, when we look at the sports,
Salvation
Swimming Australia,
Army.
terrible. Yeah, Salvation Army, awful. A whole raft of religious and non-religious institutions where kids weren't safe. Just overall, I mean, if we go back in that period, that period of historic offending, and really we can't go much back before World War II, there's just not a lot there in terms of criminal convictions to show any evidence of this going on. I'm sure it did, but we don't know the extent of it. But there seemed to be this kind of epidemic of this kind of offending that occurred post-war, starting around about the 50s, moving in the 60s and 70s. All right. Well, that's
just before we leave the Little League, I've got to tell you, I hardly ever saw it. Generally, at half time, I was around the back of the press box there, lining up for 2 cans of Victor Bravo and a pie.
There was always that, but there would be those who weren't availing themselves of the grounds catering services who'd watch the kids go around. I remember in the early days they wouldn't put the cones out, so they were actually playing on a normal sized ground. Didn't get a lot of scoring going on. I knew a couple of blokes who played. I think my good mate Peter played for North Melbourne in the Little League. But as I say, they essentially pulled kids from around local schools and local sporting clubs, and it was unfortunately and terribly prone to pedophilia.
Well, it just brought back some fond memories of the press box wings at Princess Park, the old wooden press box with the pie store at the back.
Oh, look, the current system they have with the Auskick is actually terrific, and we don't want to sort of make it extend the issue around this, which is historical offending against kids, into that Auskick thing, which is very, very different now. And I'd like to think a lot better supervised. And those people,
one of the great sporting organisations, Auskick, it is just so well organised.
And the people who are involved in it, they've got to have work safe for kids certificates.
Yeah.
So, we've at least worked that problem through. Over to the cricket, Jack, and quickly do me a favour and hit Crick Info if you can, and give me the score in New Zealand, in Wellington.
I haven't got Crick Info.
They were 1 for 62. I might be able to help you out here. They were 1 for 62 with Smith out. Now they are 147 for 4. The Black Caps won the toss. Cade Williamson won the toss and put Australia in. And Smith out for about 20 odd. He got 31. Marnus is fairly lean run has continued. He was out for 1. Cameron Green not out, 23. Travis Head bundled out for 1. He's had a fairly slim time of it in Test cricket in the last 3 or 4 tests, but it's starting to look like the Black Caps might have made the right decision in putting Australia in. It must be a little
Kane
bit of
Williams
juice
is
in
the key. Kane Williamson's the key for mine.
He is in a rich vein of form. Usman Khawaja is the one I mentioned, is the one I didn't mention. He was bowled for 33, looked to be very, very comfortable in the first half an hour or so, but he got knocked over as well. I still look at that Australian batting lineup, and I just don't. I'm not happy with people batting in the wrong places. And particularly Smith opening. I just don't think that's going to be good for him or Australian cricket.
Now getting on to Barney Rano, what did Barney say wrong in The Guardian?
Oh, there was it was like, just leave us alone. We're actually going really well, even though we're getting belted. I mean, he talked about, and he actually mentioned that there was a good 400 run loss in the third test. They were well beaten, and they have been, like Australia has been in India, bundled out. That's the problem. I think they were out for 124 in Rajkot in the second dig, and 122 in the test before that, the third test, and that's the problem. It's not Bazball. It's not whether there's Bazball or not. In the second dig, they were scoring about 2.5 and over. So it's not anything to do with baseball, but their batting's like Australia's can be too brittle, particularly in India, too brittle.
They had a very bad third day. They lost 7 for 35, the last 7 wickets for 35 runs. And then I think a mistake you identified, Ben Stokes should have opened with James Anderson but didn't, and the Indians rattled off none for 40 off 8 overs at the end of the day, and that set up the victory, really. Yeah,
Rohit Sharma, the Indian captain and opening bat, would have looked at the spinners coming down with a new inexperienced lot who've done very well, by the way. Their slow bowling team, England's slow bowling team, they've actually done pretty well, and they would have learned a hell of a lot along the way.
Especially
but
as
if you're going to bowl that stuff to
almost,
Rohit Sharma, he's going to hit you all over the park, and he did.
Especially if they bowled him back into form effectively. But all those young spinners have hardly played any county cricket.
And this was something that Brendan McCullum spoke of, because he's wondering if they're going to get any county cricket when they go back, Jack.
So Hartley's plays for Lancashire, and Lancashire have signed Nathan Lyon. So will he get a bowl while Nathan Lyon's there? And the other fella, Shoaib, he's understudy to Jack Leach at Somerset, so he won't get a bowl either.
Yeah, there's a problem there, but there's also a problem with the county setup too. You got 4-day cricket, you're not going to, it's just not a great format for developing slow bowlers.
No.
All right. Look, it's been a great series. I've actually watched pretty much all of the tests in India. We should talk about the great emerging opener, Jaiswal. We don't want to put too much on him, but his numbers as a junior cricketer and in first-class cricket, he's the youngest player to score a double century in India's first-class competition for Mumbai. And I know we think, in the old days, some of India's first-class cricket wasn't perhaps all that high a standard, but is now.
It's very competitive now.
Very competitive
What's
now.
it called? The Ranji Trophy. The Ranji Trophy, isn't it?
Ranji Trophy, that's right. And I think he first came to the eyes of everyone when he made a 300-odd in junior cricket as a 15-year-old. Extraordinary story, Jack. This young man, he's 20, just turned 23. He spent he grew up in a large household. His father, I think, ran a hardware store. I think he's the middle and probably third or fourth child with five other siblings. They identified the families obviously identified his, and this is in Uttar Pradesh. They identified his abilities as a cricketer even then, sent him down to be billeted to a local businessman in Mumbai, and apparently that all fell through. And so he spent essentially the next 3 years of his life, between the ages of 10 and 13, living in tents and whipping out a bit of, he'd be almost like a pie boy at the MCG, but around the Mumbai Stadium, he was basically making, sort of deep-fried treats and things like that for the punters. Basically, then it was realised, and one of the sort of mentors of Indian cricket sort of grabbed the kid and made him a power of attorney, by the way. So I'd like to have a look at his contracts for Jaiswal, because the world is going to boot a path to this kid's door. I don't want to put too much pressure on him, and I suggested to you in a text the other day, he could be India's Bradman. He's batted beautifully. He's got the 2 double hundreds in successive tests. Who else has done that, Jack?
Can't think of anyone who's done that.
D.G. Bradman is one who did it, albeit a bit older. And then there was another Indian cricketer but none of the big names. Not a Kohli, not a Tendulkar.
The keeper's interest got an interesting story as well. Jurev, who rightly won the man of the match for the last test. He comes from a perhaps more well-to-do family, but his father didn't want him to be a cricketer because his father wanted him to go up and do an MBA or something like that.
Would have been a doctor.
So it will be a doctor or something. He sort of told his father he wasn't playing cricket anymore, and his father's reading the paper one morning and says, "Hey, there's a Jurev kid who's making a lot of runs. He's got the same name as you."
How quickly the worm will turn there, and this is something Usman Khawaja talks about for Southern Asian players or people of Southern Asian descent who come and play cricket in Australia. Often the parents will go, "We would like you to go and be a doctor. Don't play cricket. Don't waste your time playing cricket." But now they're seeing through people like Khawaja, there's a future here. There's a future in this. It's going to be a lot harder than being a doctor. There's a lot of things can go wrong, but it's why we're starting to see a lot more Southern Asian cricketers in our domestic comps, and hopefully at the top level.
Yeah, well, Jasper Bumrah was discovered bowling on the street.
Yeah, and he came from very, very difficult background. His mother he's looked after because he makes good money now. His mother basically had to raise about 7 kids. So there are these extraordinary stories behind some of Indian cricket's emerging talent.
I think it might have been Ravi Shastri who found him bowling on the street and said, "No, this kid can actually bowl."
And can't he? I mean, he's just a ripper, and getting good players out. For mine, England continue to be too reliant on Joe Root, who is class and showed his class in the first innings of the 4th test. Really a century made surely from just will. He willed himself to get to 100. Beautiful knock. But there's just not enough quality around him. Pope hasn't made a run He probably would go to the dark net and try and buy some there, but he's struggling.
Well, he did make 196 a couple of tests ago.
No, that's Duckett. Duckett made the big 100. Pope hasn't made a run for a long time, and his position, the side, might be a little bit of an issue. And Stokes, I mean, if you're not bowling, not making runs, you're going to continue to pick him. So those are the vulnerabilities. They're the same vulnerabilities about English cricket that have been around for a long time, including during the Joe Root era, and that is this brittleness 1, 2, 3. You got Root at 4, and Crawley's obviously a good player. I think Duckett made the big 100 in the first test. He delights in the fact he doesn't leave the ball alone, and he doesn't leave the ball. He'll have a swing at it, and that just tells me it's going to end in tears, because you've got to be able to leave the ball. Anyway, I just think that their batting's a little bit shaky, and
missing Harry Brook, I would say, as well. I think
what's happened to him? Why is he not playing?
He's out injured. He's the best. He and Crawley are the best of the next generation.
Yeah, well, you'd probably have him in there ahead of Pope, but then you've got to. And look, I think they've shown some pluck. I mean, the England has their record against their record under Joe Root was pretty awful, and I think now they're sort of break even in terms of win, losses, and draws. Not many draws, and that's what makes it good cricket to watch.
Yeah, it is good,
and keeps us going.
Excellent entertainment.
Yeah, look, if you love Test cricket, it's the best way to go about it. But the idea that it's there, they've got a patent on this way of play. I mean, Adam Gilchrist must be pinching himself. All right, Jack. Now the NRL's gone to Vegas, and I haven't had a long hard look at this. What is going on there? What are they doing? Are they just playing the one game, or what's going on?
I think it's just the one game, isn't it?
I think it's only the one game, isn't it? I was talking to my next door neighbour. He goes, there might be 2 games, and he goes, and then maybe those 2 games they play each other, and he got confused. So I didn't bother to have a look at it. But Manly are playing, and is it? But it's. I don't think it's part of the NRL season, is it? Do you know?
I thought it was, but
it might be. I see. Like I say,
it's been very hard to find all this out. They just seem to presume that we all know what's going on.
Well, it's a perfect forum for Peter V'landys, who, God bless him, he just keeps going, look, we're the biggest code in Australia. I mean, it's not true, but he keeps saying it. He's been an outstanding promoter for the game. I'll tell you one thing, Jack. It's been extremely quiet. Normally by the 29th of February or even the 28th of February in any given year, there would have been at least half a dozen NRL disgraces by now. Players found in various poor circumstances, sometimes a bit of violence, maybe the odd shot fired in nightclubs, those sorts of things. Been very quiet this year. There was a bit of biff in the Broncos, but Peter V'landys, who must have taken this job on thinking any time my phone rings at 2:00 in the morning between December, January and February is not going to be a good call, has had a pretty easy time of it. But then, Jack, there's Vegas and players in Vegas, so we might still see a few disgraces. We'll see how we go.
We might.
All right. Well, that takes us out for the day, for episode 63 of the Two Jacks. I want to thank you all for listening. We did stretch out our sport, but we do like to talk about sport, Jack. You've got something else.
Just before we go.
Is it sport?
No, it's not. It's from the UK Express, a story that Meghan Markle would often ring the Queen up from the US as the pair enjoyed a close bond. And your pal Duncan McNabb, is that his name?
Duncan, yeah.
came back
Duncan
with,
McNabb, yeah.
Megan remarked, it was always lovely to chat to her, but she keeps saying at the third stroke it will be.
Oh, that was his Twitter reply. Good on him. Duncan McNabb, wonderful man, working for Channel 7, former New South Wales police officer, and one very, very significant studier of Roger Rogerson. And if you want to find out more about Roger Rogerson, you will buy Duncan McNabb's book about him. All right, well, that takes us out. Look, we do have some listeners' comments and things like that. We'll get to those next week, but we do encourage you to drop us a line. You can hit me up on Twitter. DM's always open, at Jack the Insider. And you can hit up Jack too on his Substack. Give it to me, Jack.
Yeah, HongKongJack.substack.com.
There you go. And that's how you get a hold of us and get on the show when I stop being lazy and put in listeners' comments. But we'll definitely hear from people on episode 64. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.